Imagine walking through a city of golden domes, marble palaces, and endless markets, only to find that behind the beauty lies a nightmare. Young girls torn from their families, stripped of their names and sold like cattle, their childhood stolen, their futures erased. For centuries, the Ottoman Empire turned women into property, playthings, and pawns in a brutal system that thrived on silence. This isn't a story about palaces and power. It's about the millions of forgotten voices buried beneath them. Tonight, we pull back the curtain on a history darker than death itself. The Ottoman Empire is remembered for its soaring mosques, dazzling palaces, and armies that marched across 3 continents. We celebrate its architecture, its poetry, its scientific advances, but hidden beneath those golden domes was a machinery of human exploitation so vast, it turned women into commodities, children into bargaining chips, and human dignity into currency. To understand it, we have to strip away the marble facades and step into the shadows where the empire's true economy thrived. The capture process began long before these women ever saw the walls of Constantinople. Ottoman campaigns weren't just wars for land. They were harvests, systematic sweeps designed to collect human beings as spoils of conquest. Records from the period read less like chronicles of battle and more like ledgers from a grim marketplace. Generals calculated not only territory gained but bodies acquired. When Ottoman raiders swept through the Balkans, the Caucasus, or Ukrainian villages, they carried quotas for captives, hundreds at a time. Georgian campaigns could yield 200 or 300 young women and children. Ukrainian raids often brought back 500 souls in a single sweep. It was warfare as procurement. Kidnapping refined into strategy. But what makes the system truly chilling is the precision with which these human beings were evaluated. This wasn't random pillage. It was a curated selection process, almost clinical in its efficiency. Age was everything. Girls between 12 and 18 commanded the highest prices. Appearance mattered too. Fair skin, light eyes, and European features were prized in Constantinople's markets. But beauty alone wasn't enough. Intelligence was tested in simple but revealing ways. Could a girl learn languages quickly? Did she show signs of refinement or education? These traits could raise her price dramatically, especially if she was destined for palace service. The Ottomans weren't simply collecting bodies. They were curating a catalog, an inventory of human beings tailored to specific purposes. A system where childhood, identity, and freedom were stripped away in the service of empire. Once selected, the captives entered a transportation network that operated with chilling, industrial efficiency. These weren't improvised caravans or makeshift vessels. The empire had perfected the logistics of human trafficking. Specialized ships sailed across the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, their holds redesigned not for goods, but for people. Archaeological evidence from shipwrecks reveals compartments with ventilation shafts, water storage, and crude waste systems, every detail engineered to keep human cargo alive just long enough to reach the markets. And yet, the cost was staggering. Contemporary accounts suggest that 1 in every 3 captives never survived the journey. Disease spread like wildfire in the cramped holds. Starvation hollowed bodies. Despair drove some to stop eating altogether. Thousands died before ever seeing Constantinople. But in the empire's ledgers, this was not tragedy. It was wastage, a loss calculated into the business model. The survivors were profitable enough to justify the deaths. When the ships finally docked, the captives entered a city that treated human life like a stock exchange. Constantinople's slave markets were sprawling and specialized, with districts devoted to different categories of people. The Egyptian bazaar handled domestic servants. The Grand Bazaar was the hub for luxury concubines. Children destined for palace training passed through the hands of specialized dealers. Pricing structures reflected just how deeply sexuality and hierarchy had been commodified. A Slavic peasant girl might fetch 1,500 silver coins, already a fortune for most families of the time. A Georgian noblewoman could command 4 times that amount, but the highest tier, what traders called palace quality, sold for sums equivalent to a small estate. These women weren't just merchandise. They were investments purchased by the empire's elite to secure influence, power, and prestige. The buying process was as humiliating as it was invasive. Potential owners inspected women as if they were livestock. Teeth checked for health, hands for signs of labor, even bodies examined for fertility. Each step stripped away the last remnants of identity until nothing was left but numbers on a ledger. But the markets were only the beginning. The most valuable women were not destined for wealthy homes, but for a place far more infamous, the Sultan's imperial harem. The slave markets were only the first chapter in a captive's nightmare. For the most prized women, the journey ended at the gates of Topkapi Palace, home to the Sultan's imperial harem. Forget the paintings and stories from European travelers, with their fantasies of silken cushions and leisurely luxury. The harem was not a paradise of romance. It was a prison dressed in velvet, designed for one purpose: the systematic erasure and remaking of human beings. The process began the moment a woman crossed the threshold. Her name was stripped away, replaced with something foreign chosen to sever her ties to family and homeland. Speaking her native language was forbidden. Contact with others from her region was deliberately blocked. Within months, many women could no longer recall the sound of their birth names. Identity itself was the first casualty. Religion followed. Conversion was mandatory and forced through ritual humiliation. Captives were told that their old faiths were sins. Some were forced to destroy sacred objects brought from home. The message was clear. Their past was a mistake, their only future lay in obedience. Inside the harem, survival meant navigating a brutal hierarchy. At the bottom were the odalik, servants condemned to endless labor and constant fear. Above them were attendants who waited on higher-ranking women. Then came the Iqbal and Gözde, favorites rumored to have caught the Sultan's attention. At the very top sat the Haseki Sultan, the woman who bore the Sultan's children, wielding immense power inside palace walls. But here lies the truth that outsiders almost always missed. The vast majority of these women never once laid eyes on the Sultan. Their lives unfolded in a limbo state, neither free nor fully enslaved, trapped in an institution that reduced them to expendable property. The harem's daily rhythm was psychological warfare. Women were pitted against one another in elaborate games of rivalry. They were encouraged to inform on competitors, sabotage allies, and fight for favor that might never come. The empire had engineered an environment where even the natural bond of sisterhood became another weapon of control. The harem was more than hierarchy. It was discipline by terror. Every rule, every whisper of defiance carried consequences, and the punishment system reveals just how deliberately the empire weaponized cruelty. Minor mistakes, an improperly folded garment, a word spoken out of turn, could mean beatings or days in solitary confinement. More serious infractions like disobedience or attempted escape often ended in expulsion. But expulsion was not freedom. For most women, it meant death. Stripped of skills, connections, and resources, they had no way to survive outside palace walls. The most severe penalties were reserved for women accused of betrayal, infidelity, conspiracy, or secret alliances. Beneath Topkapi Palace, chambers still exist that once echoed with the screams of captives subjected to psychological torture. Methods were designed not to leave permanent scars, but to break resistance while preserving value. The empire had perfected the art of destroying dignity while keeping the body intact for continued use. Overseeing this system was a cadre of eunuchs, men mutilated as children, turned into guards and administrators for a world where normal human relationships were impossible. Many of these eunuchs had themselves been victims of the same trafficking networks that supplied the harem. Castrated and enslaved, they rose to positions of authority, becoming both survivors and enforcers. The irony is as tragic as it is grotesque. Victims transformed into gatekeepers of oppression, enforcing rules on women who shared their fate of stolen humanity. At its height, the imperial harem housed over 1,000 women. Multiply that across 6 centuries of Ottoman rule, and the numbers become staggering. Historians estimate that over 1 million women passed through this system, each one stripped of her past, her family, her freedom. And yet, the imperial harem was only the pinnacle. Beyond palace walls, smaller versions of this institution spread across the empire, maintained by governors, generals, and wealthy merchants. A vast network of exploitation that reached from Istanbul's domes to the smallest provincial towns. What unfolded inside the Sultan's palace was only the apex of a much larger system. Across Ottoman lands, provincial governors, military commanders, and wealthy merchants maintained smaller harems of their own. These regional harems operated on the same principles but with even fewer restraints. Women who didn't meet the palace's exacting standards were distributed into these networks, ensuring that no captive escaped exploitation. But the system went beyond possession. It was designed for reproduction. The empire treated women as both objects of desire and instruments of policy. Breeding programs were carefully managed to produce the next generation of Ottoman elites. Children born in the harem weren't free. Their lives were scripted before they even opened their eyes. Male children, barred by law from inheriting the throne, were trained for military or administrative posts. Many were sent to govern distant provinces, useful tools of the empire yet forever marked as products of their mother's captivity. Daughters faced an even crueler fate. They were raised to enter the very same system that had destroyed their mothers. From an early age they were drilled in the arts of submission, trained to sing, dance, charm, and obey long before they could understand what those lessons meant. The cycle was self-perpetuating, each generation feeding the next wave of victims. Palace physicians kept meticulous records of women's reproductive lives. Menstrual cycles, fertility patterns, and pregnancy outcomes were tracked like agricultural data. Contraception was forbidden unless ordered by the palace itself. A woman who failed to conceive could be expelled or worse. Reproduction wasn't just a duty, it was an obligation enforced with life or death consequences. And what happened when a woman aged out of her usefulness? The empire had no retirement for concubines. By 30, most were discarded. Some sold into brothels, others abandoned on the streets. Excavations around palace grounds reveal mass graves of women showing signs of violent death. Grim evidence that many were simply eliminated when no longer profitable. For the Ottomans, a woman's worth existed only in her ability to serve, first as an object of pleasure, then as a vessel for children, and finally as disposable waste. The devastation of the harem system didn't stop at palace gates. It rippled outward, tearing apart families, villages, and entire communities across the empire. Parents lived in constant terror that their daughters might be taken. Some resorted to desperate measures, scarring their own children's faces, breaking bones, anything to make them less desirable to Ottoman collectors. Imagine the heartbreak of a mother forced to harm her daughter, not out of cruelty, but as the only chance to save her from something worse. Folk memory carried these wounds forward. Across Ukraine, Georgia, and Poland, songs mourned the daughters who vanished into chains. Ballads told of mothers watching helplessly as soldiers dragged their children away. Lullabies spoke of little ones stolen in the night, their voices fading into silence. In some places, death itself was remembered as an act of mercy. Funeral songs describing girls who died before they could be taken, their graves seen as safer than the Sultan's palace. The trauma was generational. Families who lost daughters were left broken, villages depopulated, whole regions stripped of their youth. Over time, fear itself became a way of life. Parents whispered warnings, communities passed down stories of loss, and an entire cultural memory formed around the terror of Ottoman capture. The empire had achieved something horrifying. It reshaped entire societies, forcing people to view their daughters not as blessings but as potential targets. Childhood innocence was replaced with vigilance. Ordinary acts of love, teaching, nurturing, raising children were shadowed by the constant threat of disappearance. These stories, preserved in song and folklore, became the hidden history of the conquered. While official Ottoman records reduced women to numbers and prices, the people who suffered kept their humanity alive in memory. Their grief and resistance were sung at firesides, whispered in prayers, carved into the collective identity of nations living under imperial rule. What the empire called procurement, communities remembered as abduction. What records listed as inventory, families mourned as lost daughters. And though centuries have passed, those cultural scars remain etched into the memory of entire peoples. Behind the cruelty of the harem lay cold arithmetic. This wasn't merely indulgence for a sultan. It was a cornerstone of Ottoman economics. The empire treated sexual exploitation as infrastructure. Revenues from the sale, training, and redistribution of women fed directly into the imperial treasury. Money earned from human trafficking helped finance military campaigns, fund construction projects, and grease the wheels of palace administration. Diplomatic records reveal just how normalized this trade became. Foreign envoys documented contracts that included clauses for the exchange of women, carefully negotiated as if they were commodities like silk or grain. Letters between Ottoman officials read like procurement orders, lists of quotas, descriptions of desired qualities, discussions of price and delivery schedules. Even military campaigns were shaped by these incentives. When commanders chose targets in the Balkans or the Caucasus, they calculated not just the strategic value of a fortress or a port, but the potential yield of captives. Victory wasn't measured only in land conquered, it was tallied in bodies. Within the palace itself, the harem functioned almost like a university of subjugation. Women weren't locked away in silence. They were trained meticulously, deliberately in languages, poetry, music, and the so-called arts of pleasure. These lessons elevated their market value, transforming human beings into curated investments for the empire's elite. The trainers were often older women who had survived long enough to rise into teaching roles. They became complicit in the cycle, passing on the very tools that had once been used against them. In doing so, the system turned victims into perpetrators, ensuring its own survival generation after generation. What emerges from this picture is chilling efficiency. The Ottoman state didn't just allow sexual slavery, it codified it, bureaucratized it, and profited from it at every level. From the soldier in the field to the Sultan himself, the exploitation of women was woven into the empire's political DNA. The result was a society where exploitation wasn't a hidden shame, but a normalized engine of power and wealth. And that normalization reshaped not only the empire, but the very people who lived under it. The Ottoman harem system wasn't just tolerated, it was legalized, justified, and integrated into the empire's very laws. Islamic jurisprudence of the time was twisted to sanction sexual slavery, with clerics issuing fatwas that allowed men to keep concubines under the guise of religious tradition. This legal scaffolding gave the empire a moral shield, a way to present systematic exploitation not as abuse but as divine order. It was law, not crime. Within this framework, women were reduced to property categories. They could be bought, sold, inherited, or exchanged. A daughter stolen from her family could be passed through half a dozen owners before reaching the palace, her life tracked not in years, but in transactions, and the Ottoman state was not alone. European powers, those same nations that later condemned Turkish barbarism, were deeply complicit. Venetian merchants ran bustling slave markets where Circassian and Georgian women were paraded for bidding. French and Austrian envoys supplied gifts of women to maintain political favor. Even Polish and Hungarian nobles, sworn enemies of the empire, sometimes traded their own subjects into Ottoman hands for profit. It was an international economy of flesh, where borders mattered less than wealth and demand. From the Black Sea ports to Mediterranean trade hubs, women's bodies became tokens in a global game of power. What makes this more chilling is the normalization. Children grew up seeing slave markets as ordinary. Merchants advertised women as rare goods. Poets romanticized the beauty of harem girls in their verses. Pain and violence were wrapped in the language of art, law, and tradition until the system seemed natural, inevitable. But under the layers of justification lay the simple truth. Women were stripped of humanity. Every law passed, every treaty signed, every poem written to glorify the harem was part of a vast machinery designed to erase personhood and replace it with profit. This legal and cultural normalization is why the system endured for centuries. It wasn't merely violence, it was violence given structure, legitimacy, and prestige. For outsiders, the harem was a place of mystery, whispers of jewels, silks, and forbidden pleasures. But for the women trapped inside, daily life was far from a dream. It was a battlefield of survival, where every glance, every gesture, every word carried consequences. From the moment a girl entered, she was stripped of her identity. Names were changed, languages suppressed, past lives erased. The first lessons weren't about luxury but obedience, how to bow, how to walk, how to remain silent in the presence of power. Training followed, designed to transform captives into living ornaments of the empire. Some learned music, dance, and poetry. Others mastered languages or etiquette to serve visiting diplomats. A chosen few were instructed in the intimate arts that elevated their value to the Sultan himself. Each skill was another rung in a brutal hierarchy. At the bottom were the newest captives, girls who scrubbed floors, prepared baths, and endured constant humiliation. Above them were the trained attendants prized for their beauty or talent. Higher still were the Sultan's favorites, women who lived in gilded chambers but in constant fear of replacement. At the very top sat the Valide Sultan, the Sultan's mother, wielding immense power as matriarch of the harem. Survival demanded cunning. Some women formed alliances, clinging to influential patrons for protection. Others weaponized beauty, wit, or talent to climb the ranks. Yet betrayal was always near. A misplaced word could end a life. Poison in a cup, a sudden disappearance, rumors of intrigue filled the corridors. But not every act inside was cruelty. Bonds of sisterhood formed in shadows, as women comforted one another, shared memories of lost homes, or secretly taught each other the songs of their childhood. In those quiet rebellions, humanity endured. Even when the system worked to erase it, the harem was a paradox, a prison dressed as a palace, a place where women could become powerful figures or vanish without a trace. For every queen who influenced the empire, countless others remained nameless, forgotten, their lives consumed in silence. Beneath the shimmer of silk and the perfume of roses, the harem carried a darker truth. It was not only a place of training and politics, it was also a theater of fear, where punishment and abuse enforced obedience. Disobedience, no matter how small, carried brutal consequences. A servant who spilled water, a concubine who spoke out of turn, even a glance mistaken for defiance could provoke rage. Beatings were common. Some women were flogged, others starved. There are accounts of girls locked for days in dark chambers, left with nothing but silence and terror. The Sultan's displeasure was deadlier still. Rumors whispered of women strangled with silken cords, their bodies quietly removed under cover of night. To the outside world, they simply disappeared. Inside the palace, everyone understood what had happened. The message was clear. Beauty could elevate you to power, but a single misstep could erase you forever. Yet physical punishment was only part of the cruelty. The deeper violence was psychological. Women lived under constant surveillance, never free to move, never free to choose. Their value was measured by youth, beauty, and obedience, qualities that faded with time. For many, every day was a countdown, a slow march toward irrelevance and disposal. Jealous rivalries sharpened the atmosphere. A concubine favored one night might wake the next morning to find herself the target of poison, slander, or exile to the lower ranks. The competition was relentless, and in that environment, cruelty became a survival strategy. Even within this nightmare, some women clung to fragments of resistance. Secret prayers, coded songs, whispered stories of home. Small acts that reminded them they were more than possessions. But the weight of the system crushed most voices into silence. Behind the shimmering curtains and polished marble floors, the harem was not a paradise, but a gilded cage. For every tale of luxury, there were 100 of violence, stories erased from official records, but carried in the whispers of survivors and the scars left behind. For centuries, the harem was painted as a place of silence and submission, but within its walls, a very different story unfolded, one of intrigue, strategy, and power struggles that shaped the Ottoman Empire itself. At the heart of this world stood the Valide Sultan, the Sultan's mother. Far from a passive figure, she often held enormous influence, guiding imperial decisions, forging alliances, and controlling access to her son. Some called her the real ruler of the empire, a queen cloaked in invisibility. Other women too rose to extraordinary heights. Roxolana, or Harem Sultan, once a captive from Ukraine, became the legal wife of Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent. Her rise was unprecedented. She maneuvered through rivals, secured her children's positions, and even shaped foreign policy. Ambassadors wrote of her as a stateswoman in her own right, pulling strings behind the throne. But such power always came at a cost. Every step upward meant stepping over others. Poisonings, assassinations, and whispered betrayals marked the corridors. Behind every Valide Sultan or powerful consort stood dozens of rivals who vanished, sometimes into exile, sometimes into graves. The harem thus became both a prison and a political arena. It was a paradox. Women robbed of freedom on one hand, yet wielding influence that could make or break emperors on the other. The palace chroniclers who tried to erase their names couldn't hide the truth. Many of the empire's turning points came from decisions made inside those chambers. But it wasn't just about power plays. These women were survivors. They mastered diplomacy, understood the rhythms of politics, and learned how to turn vulnerability into leverage. Their victories proved that even within a system built on exploitation, human resilience and ambition could bend history itself. Still, their stories cast a shadow. For every Harem sultan who carved her name into history, countless others remained nameless. Footnotes in a game of survival where power was rare and suffering was the rule. The harem was not only a symbol of oppression, it was also a crucible of power, where women who had been stolen from their homes reshaped the destiny of one of history's greatest empires. At its height, the harem seemed untouchable, a fortress of silk and power. But over time, the very system that once gave the empire strength began to poison it from within. The sultans themselves changed. Earlier rulers were warriors, men who led armies across continents. But later generations were raised almost entirely inside the harem. Instead of military discipline, they grew up surrounded by luxury, flattery, and manipulation. Princes became sheltered, inexperienced, and dangerously dependent on the women and eunuchs who controlled their lives. This isolation weakened the empire's leadership. Decisions once made by battle-hardened commanders were now swayed by palace intrigues, whispers in corridors, and rivalries inside the harem. Policies were shaped not by strategy but by personal feuds and private alliances. Corruption thrived. The endless flow of money into the harem drained resources from the empire's military and infrastructure. Bribes became the norm. Eunuchs, once mere guards, rose into kingmakers, selling influence to the highest bidder. What had begun as a system of control turned into a marketplace of power. The psychological rot spread too. When rulers were more concerned with pleasing favorites than leading armies, the empire's enemies gained ground. Provinces rebelled, borders shrank, and once mighty Ottoman forces found themselves unprepared for modern wars. The empire's decline wasn't just about cannons and ships, it was about a leadership hollowed out by decadence. Historians call it the Sultanate of Women, a period when mothers, wives, and concubines wielded extraordinary influence. While some of them proved capable leaders, the system itself bred instability. Coup, assassinations, and sudden shifts in power became routine, eroding the empire's foundations. By the 18th century, the harem was no longer a symbol of dominance. It had become a symbol of weakness. What once projected control now revealed corruption, indulgence, and decay. The empire that had conquered cities across 3 continents was crumbling, undone in part by the very system it had built to secure itself. The harem, meant to be the empire's strength, had become one of its greatest vulnerabilities, a gilded cage not only for women, but for the Ottoman throne itself. By the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire was a shadow of its former self. European powers were advancing in science, industry, and military technology, while the Ottomans clung to institutions that belonged to another age. The harem, once the empire's most guarded secret, became a subject of fascination and scandal in the West. Travelers and diplomats wrote lurid accounts of what they imagined happened behind the palace walls. Artists painted exotic, romanticized fantasies, silken cushions, languid women, golden lamps. But these images were lies. They hid the reality, generations of women who lived and died as property, their lives erased by an empire that saw them as tools. The final blow came with the collapse of the Ottoman Empire after World War I. In 1922, the last sultan was deposed, and the new Republic of Turkey abolished the institution of the imperial harem. Its gates closed forever. The women inside were dispersed, some released into a world they had never seen, others lost to poverty, anonymity, or silence. The eunuchs, too, were cast aside, relics of a system no one wanted to remember. But while the walls of the harem crumbled, its scars remained. Across the Balkans, the Caucasus, and the Middle East, folk songs, oral histories, and family stories still whisper of daughters who never came home. Genetic studies reveal the legacy and bloodlines long after the empire itself vanished. The trauma lives on, hidden in silence, carried by descendants who may never even know the source of their sorrow. And so, we are left with a haunting truth. Behind the domes, the palaces, and the grandeur of one of history's greatest empires There was a system that devoured human lives for centuries, a system that normalized cruelty, turned love into politics, and taught entire generations that women were currency. The story of the Ottoman harem is not just a tale of the past. It is a warning, a reminder of how easily power can corrupt intimacy, how quickly beauty can be twisted into bondage, and how entire civilizations can blind themselves to cruelty when it is wrapped in gold and silk. These women deserve more than to be remembered as curiosities in paintings or footnotes in archives. They deserve to be remembered as human beings, daughters, mothers, and sisters, whose voices were silenced, but whose suffering still echoes across history.